20-year petroleum-based infrastructure. Our whole lives depend on it.
In the wise words of Billy Bob Thornton, we have 120-year oil infrastructure and our whole lives depend on it. And that is why, in simple terms, a war in the Middle East is leading to a loss in confidence and potential increases in interest rates in the UK property market. In this video, I'm going to have a look at how this is possible, how a war in the Middle East impacts the UK market, and whether you should be worried about that. And the way I'm going to analyze that is by looking at past data, property price growth, increases in values, leveraged returns per annum, in order to understand whether we should be concerned by the impact of these events on the property market or whether we should continue our long-term plans as we intended. Oil prices, Brent and crude, are sitting around $100 a barrel at the moment, meaning they're up about 50% in 1 month, which is massive. And there's been some reports saying that they could potentially even go up to $200. Why is that? The Strait of Homeowners, where a large amount of the world's oil passes through, is effectively being shut down with bombs and attacks, meaning that the supply, the oil can't get through, therefore oil prices increase. How does this then feed into property? When oil prices increase, there is upwards inflationary pressure on almost everything. Heating and gas is a simple one, but the oil we use and the oil we need is in everything. It's in transporting you to work in your car. It's transporting goods and services around the world in tankers, on container ships. It's in flying people around. It's used in producing plastics. It's used in producing packaging, used in producing some clothes. It is used in almost everything. Therefore, if oil prices increase or inflate, then general inflation usually follows suit. And we saw this in 2022 with the Russia-Ukraine war, when inflation reached 11% for the year off the back of energy becoming much more expensive. If inflation increases or inflationary pressure increases, the Bank of England is more likely to keep interest rates the same or increase them. Now, why is that? Interest rates are a massive part of the Bank of England's tool for controlling inflation, because if you increase interest rates, you're likely to get a higher return on your savings in the bank. Therefore, money comes out of supply and goes into the bank, therefore decreasing inflationary pressure. And also most people's biggest expense, their mortgage, if you're on a variable rate, also increases, which further takes money out of supply. Therefore, downward pressure on inflation. The Bank of England has an inflation target of 2%. So if inflation is over that, they will likely use interest rates to control it. Now, the Financial Times this week reported that they believe the next meeting of the Bank of England on Thursday next week will see an interest rate hold as opposed to a potential cut that many were expecting. Now, the newspapers are obviously running with this and saying that it is very negative and the house market is going to be impacted. I would just like to caveat by saying, look at how far we've come in the past 24 months. It's even if interest rates remain at 3.75 or go up slightly, we're in a much better situation than we were when they were at 5%. Therefore, should you be concerned? Should you change your plans, or should you stick with your long-term portfolio building? I've pulled average house price data in order to analyze this over the past 20 years from 2006, 2011, 2016, 2021, and present day. And what I'm going to do is look back at that and see what growth has been in property prices, what your leverage return would have been if you put down a 30% deposit, and then your annualized or yearly return based on that. Why is this important? Because over the past 20 years, there have been heaps of these black swan or large events where people said the UK market was going to crash and it will never be the same. You had an actual crash in 2008, you've had Brexit votes, you've had US elections, you've had wars, you've had all sorts. So should you have listened to the naysayers or should you have continued with your plans? The data here is pulled from the Office of National Statistics. You can pull it from different places and average figures do differ, but I've used Office of National Statistics for now. They're saying average house price in 2026 is £270,000. In 2021, £232,000. In 2016, £191,000. In 2011, £154,000. And in 2006, £139,000. Okay, if you bought in 2006, just before the crash of 2007-2008, which according to Fred Harris, 18-year property cycle guy, is the winner's curse, would you have made no money or would you still be up? So from then to now, house prices have increased 94%, or in monetary terms, £131,000. If you put down a 30% deposit on the property, average property price back in 2006, your leverage return would be 314%. And then that's an annualized return of 15.71%. What if you bought in 2011? Property prices have increased £116,000 based on the average, which is a percentage increase of 75%. Using a 30% deposit, your leverage return would have been 251%, giving you an annualized or yearly average return of 16.74%. Now, these figures are simplified. They're not taking into account the money you get from the rent. They're not taking into account costs, that sort of stuff. It's just a basic overview to give you an idea of how markets move despite negative headlines and black swan events. 2016 then, average house price at 191,000. So from then to now, an increase of 79,000 or a measly 41% in 10 years, so 4% per annum. Not great, but again, leverage return using a deposit, that's an increase of 137% or an annual return of 13.7%. What was happening in 2016? Donald Trump, Brexit, heaps of negative headlines. Now let's look at 2021, what was happening there. COVID, as we all know, a US presidential election. China was cranking up pressure, talking about Taiwan, all of this sort of stuff. A lot of uncertainty again. From then to now, house prices on average have increased £38,000, an increase of 16%, not massive. Leveraged, that's a 54% increase, which is 10.92% per annum. Now I'll summarize this by referencing a Morgan Housel book called Same as Ever. He says in order to understand the future and what's going to happen, we need to look at back and look at historical events. And one key theme throughout history is that we will always have these unpredicted events, whether they're wars, crises, pandemics, they will always happen. And the sooner you realize for them and prepare for them in your plans, and when he says prepare, he doesn't mean plan for them because you can't prepare for them, but when you're aware of the fact that they will happen and your strategy then aligns to that, you can make the most of it. So looking back over the past 20 years, what's that taught us is that property prices have gone up. You would have still made money despite crashes, wars, elections, pandemics, all of this sort of stuff. So is it any different now? In my opinion, no, I don't think potential interest rate increases should change your opinion, because the easiest way to make money in property is buying and holding. If you'd like more information on buying your first property whilst an expat or building a portfolio, then you can pop your details down below and get a copy of my book, The Expat Property Playbook, which will talk you through all the steps involved in purchasing a property in the UK whilst living overseas.